What is up, fellow summoners? Welcome to the channel today for another champ refresh video. This whole series kicked off in the tech class with Iron Patriot, moved over to the mutant class with Colossus, and last week we had the science class. We looked at Luke Cage. And this week I've decided to move over into the skill class and was asking you guys for suggestions on who you'd like to see me do this on. And most of the answers that came back were Karnak and Daredevil Netflix. I saw a few people in there that had mentioned Magneto. And also Black Panther, the classic Black Panther, which truthfully all of those need a little bit of refresh. But ultimately, between Karnak and the Netflix version of Daredevil, you know, even though I'm not in love with Karnak, he is his own unique character, his own unique animations, abilities, and all that. Whereas Daredevil is just kind of a copy-paste of the classic version that was already in the game, which is unfortunate because I really enjoyed the Netflix series of Daredevil. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth the time to go watch it. But he looked really cool. I was really excited for this character. Unfortunately, everything that made Daredevil Classic good, you know, his ability to 100% evade projectiles, they removed that from the Netflix version. Try to tweak him a little bit, make him more offensive based by giving him an armor break. And I think he's also got a little bit more block there as well. But at the end of the day, it came off kind of cheap. You know, if you're looking for a character just to do damage, there's a lot better options out there than Daredevil Netflix. So even though I really like the character, even though I think he looks really cool, I decided to do the refresh on him because I think he needs a lot more love at this point than Karnak does. So let's jump over into the ability lists. Let's walk through what he's currently got, what I would keep, what I would dump, and ultimately what my ideas are. So let's get into it. So when you read through Daredevil Netflix, his abilities, he looks like he's going to be a fairly decent champ. But when you actually play with him, he actually feels a little bit underpowered and almost feels like he's missing an element. Like there's something about his build, his rotation, it's just not complete. Like it's missing something. So for this character, there's actually a lot of things here that I would keep, a couple things that I would tweak. And then one big addition, well, two actually, two big additions, one to the signature ability and one to a buff that I'd like to make up and give to him. But I'm going to skip over his signature ability, World on Fire. I'm going to come back to that at the end to tie everything together. But let's just look here at his passives. If you watch the show, then you know who Mr. Potter was. He actually made the suit that you see Daredevil wearing, which I don't necessarily know if, when you look at him as a character, if you really understand as far as that suit was built to be able to deflect knives, possibly even stray bullets. So there's actually a little bit more armor there than what you would expect. And it says there, the remarkable suit crafted by Mr. Potter can turn aside knives, gunfire, granting Daredevil physical resistance against all attacks. I get that, and I like it, but I would like to change it and make it a little more interactive. What I would like to see is when you start the fight, have, I don't know how many, but let's just, for sake of argument, let's say you have 3 armor up buffs. And every time that you get hit, one of those armor up buffs you lose, and it's converted into a physical resistance. The reason for that is the idea that this suit is not like, alien technology, like a guy made this. So this thing is going to break down over time as it takes abuse and as it takes damage. But you start with the armor up buff because that can handle and reduce both physical resistance and energy resistance. And then as you take damage, as you get hit, this wouldn't be block damage, this would only be physical hits that you take. Again, you lose one of your armor up buffs and it's replaced with a physical buff. Then again, you lose another armor up buff when you hit, gain a physical buff, until you've lost all of your armor up buffs. They've been replaced by physical resistance buffs. And then every hit you get from that point moving forward, you just drop off the physical resistance buffs, and until you have no more defensive buffs. I hope that was fairly straightforward. But I think that, even though it's not changing him drastically from what you see, it's just a little bit more interactive, and I think gives him a little bit more defensive presence than just kind of the straight small percentage of physical resistance across the board. The chance there, you see 35% chance that a block reduces all damage. I still like that. You know, if we're going to give him a little bit more armor up at the beginning, maybe we need to lower that chance a little bit, but wouldn't mess with that a whole lot. The additional critical hit, leave it, take it. I don't really care. I don't think it plays much of a difference once we start getting into here. The chance to evade 15% projectile attacks, 15% to evade projectile attacks, I should say. I also think it needs to stay there. Would not raise that up. If you want a character that can do that on a high percentage, that's what the Daredevil Classic version is there for. So I don't want the two to kind of mix on too many things. So I don't want to see that percentage go up any higher. And then finally, the last thing that I wouldn't touch is there where it talks about all attacks. When the enemy is stunned, mediums and heavy attacks have an 85% chance to armor break the opponent, which I have actually had upwards of like 15 or 16 armor breaks before, and he still doesn't hit real hard in his current version, so I don't see any reason to nerf that or get rid of it. In fact, I wouldn't make it any stronger once you see some of the other changes we're going to make. I think having the armor breaks there are just another ability that I keep with him. Okay, so now that I've finally gotten through all that, I know that feels like I haven't done anything to the character yet, but that's why I was talking about before. He feels like an unfinished champ. So all of these things that I've mentioned, outside of his suit and the armor up abilities, have pretty much stayed the same up to this point. So now what I would like to see added is a new debuff that Daredevil Netflix can put on the enemy called Puncture. You can call it Puncture, Puncture Wound, whatever you want to call it, something like that. But the way that it's a stackable debuff, the way that you start stacking it is every time that you crit with a special attack with an S1 and an S2, you're going to get a stack of Puncture. And in the current animation for the S1 and the S2, there's a couple different hits that each one of those separately have a chance to crit. So every time you use an S1 and an S2, for each one of those crits, there's an opportunity to gain several stacks. Now, this is going to serve a couple of different purposes. The first is it's going to lower defensive ability accuracy. Because you can stack it potentially so high, I would say each stack is probably only good for about 10% reduction, and I would make that last for a total of 15 seconds. I think 15 seconds is long enough for you to be able to use maybe 2 S1s and to have a decent stack going on, but also it's short enough to be able to drop that off to where you don't have like a 100% defensive ability reduction for like the entire fight. That's not really the purpose of it. So Puncture Wound, each stack lowers defensive ability accuracy by 10%, then also lowers regen by 10%, which I think actually the regen, it's not a heal block, but it potentially could be almost as strong as a heal block if you could keep that up. By doing this, it gives him a little bit of utility without making his utility the main focus of the character. You don't really have to do anything special necessarily to see it stack, but the way that you play the character, whether you want to spam the S1, hold the S1s, and use them as often as you can to stack this thing up in anticipation of a regen that's coming or something like that, it gives you a little bit of play style, and you're able to manipulate the situation a little bit by having that. Again, without making that whole thing too far away from his normal rotation. Now, the other big change that we're going to see then would be with his signature ability. His signature ability, World on Fire, I think that describes his signature ability well, World on Fire. If you've watched, again, the show, you know exactly what that's all talking about. But totally scrap the way we know World on Fire right now. You know, the longer the fight goes, or excuse me, the more debuffs you have on yourself right now, the more determined that he gets, which increases his critical rate. But I don't know. I would rather play to not have debuffs put on me, and have a signature ability that I can actually use if I'm being aggressive and playing well and not getting hit. So the way that I would like to see it change is there's an idea that Matt Murdock is his name if you weren't familiar, but Matt has the ability, you know, if when you're watching the show, he's blind, but he can still sense, you know, his hearing, even his smell is all so highly tuned that there were several points throughout the show, like when he gets hurt or when somebody else gets hurt, like he knows, like he can sense, he can feel the vibrations in the bones and things, like he knows exactly what part of you is injured. He can sense movement around him. And so World on Fire, his signature ability, all kind of plays into that idea. So the way that, I don't know how you would want it to read, but essentially Matt analyzes the movement of his enemy throughout the fight, and he starts to anticipate their next movement. And this is for defensive and offensive purposes. So every 5th hit that you receive, whether you block the hit or it's a parry, or you're just taking regular damage or getting hit, every 5th hit is going to have its damage reduced by 50%. So whether that was a regular hit or whether that was a critical hit, whatever it is, let's say it was going to be 2,000, now it's 1,000. And then what will happen is once that 5th hit occurs, you're going to get a World on Fire buff that's going to pop up for you. And what that means is that your next 5th hit in turn is going to have increase to its critical damage if it does crit, but more importantly than that, it's going to become unblockable. So there's actually a little bit of gameplay here, because if you're attacking the character and just trying to do a regular 5-hit combo, after you do 4 hits, it may make sense actually to pull back and to wait, because that 5th hit is unblockable. So it makes more sense to do 4 hits, pull back, then come back in, have an unblockable first hit. Even though it's a light attack, it may not do as much damage, but then you can kind of combo another 5 hits there. Or you could do 3 or 4 hits and then use a special. So a little bit of gameplay, a little bit of strategy there. Never really seen anything like that before. Then once you've used your 5th hit, the World on Fire buff falls off, and it won't come back up again until you get hit 5 times. So it's kind of this defensive, offensive, back and forth kind of strategy that's got to take place, because really you could almost time, if you manage to push your enemy into an S3, if you could somehow time and get 4 hits and then just sit back and wait for them to use that S3 as the 5th hit to reduce its damage, I could see multiple purposes and multiple uses for that. Then finally, for all of his special attacks, I would like to see the animations changed. They're an exact copy-paste of classic Daredevil. I don't know what I would like to see. Obviously, it's going to be all some sort of a physical attack. I think one thing that might differentiate them is the ninja sticks, nunchuck things, whatever you see there that he's got on the side of his suit. You could incorporate those into his S1 and his S2 for Daredevil Netflix instead of using them in the S3. As far as the abilities go that trigger from the S1 and S2, I wouldn't give them additional abilities outside of what they already have. 100% chance to stun for 2.5 or 3.5 seconds whenever you crit. That'll give you an opportunity then, while they're stunned, to have an 85% chance to armor break with heavy attacks and medium attacks. You can build those back up. And then finally with the S3, there's nothing even listed on there currently, but with the S3, most of his abilities are all centered around his rotation, throwing in the S1 and the S2 to build up the puncture wounds. So if you do get to an S3, you probably were pushed there. You don't really want to necessarily use it. But if you do get there, I think that it should be able to refresh your 3 armor ups that you started the fight with, and then also apply a puncture wound that lasts longer than the standard puncture wound you get from your critical hits with your S1 and S2. So instead of the standard 15 seconds, maybe make it 20 seconds or 25 seconds, something like that. So again, you don't really necessarily want to be using the S3. There's more usefulness down in the S1 and S2. But again, if you do manage to get pushed to it and you have to use it, at least it'll have something that incorporates back into his playstyle a little bit more than just having nothing as we see now and just a little bit of damage. If these changes were applied, he'd be a really good combination of a tanky / Alliance War offensive character. Increase to his block damage, the armor up, the physical resistance, the ability to reduce bleed effects by 15%, the ability to reduce damage every 5th hit that you're taking. That all gives him a little bit of defensive abilities. Even though he doesn't have a regen, you'll still be able to be taking hits, many hits, being able to get through Alliance War fights. If you pair that up with things like Inequity and Resonate, with the fact that he will be building up so many not only puncture wounds, but also armor breaks, and those things are going to reduce the damage as well if you're running those masteries. And then on the flip side of that, you'll have the ability, if you time everything right, your 5th hit is unblockable. So if you're having issues with stun immune characters or something like that, that 5th hit will help you out. If you're having problems with Nightcrawler or Spider-Man, you could try to build up your puncture wounds on the enemy. Try to keep those as high as you can for the majority of the fight to reduce the chance for them to evade. So I think that Yondu, like I mentioned before, he really opened my eyes to the fact that having a character that is purpose-built maybe for one part of the game is not necessarily a bad idea. Like and I'm sure they didn't really do this with that in mind, but I had always kind of looked at a champ and thought, well, if you can't use them in AQ and AW, and if they don't have a regen or some sort of great utility, like they're no good. But I think there's actually a flip side of that, and Yondu has shown me that if you've got, you've got basically different rosters. You've got an AW roster, you've got an AQ roster, special event roster, and if you have champs like Yondu and like this Daredevil Netflix I'm talking about here, that you could build up specifically for Alliance War offense. Even though he may not be useful in other purposes, I think overall he'd still be a really good champ to have in your roster. So let me know what you guys think. I really, as I say at the end of all these videos, I really do enjoy putting these together. As always, if you have suggestions, if you have ideas, I would love to discuss them, love to talk about them, love to hear from you guys. Kabam's probably not listening, but it's still fun to play around with some new ideas. All right, guys, as always, appreciate so much the support. Until I see you all in the next one, have a great day.